My thesis was an attempt to take a different approach to a very traditional topic, the study of Greek sculpture. In this aim, I experimented with investigating the potential value of cataloguing Hellenistic sculpture into a large-scale database, quantifying it across a variety of variables, and utilizing statistical methods in a data-driven approach to investigating material culture. The research question was essentially this: could cultural trends in the Hellenistic world be inferred or evidenced through statistical variation in their sculptural depiction, as a separate complementary approach to the close qualitative analysis of statues as works of art? In the theme of this year's Amphorae conferences, I'd like to contextualize the Hellenistic period as one of dramatic and substantial change, indeed one of near constant flux, a period of cultures meeting, mingling, and modifying. As a quick refresher, the Hellenistic period is generally considered the time frame loosely ranging from the conquests of Alexander of Macedon in 323 BCE, extending arguably as far as the death of the Ptolemaic queen Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE. On the slide, you can see a map of the Hellenistic kingdoms circa 185 BCE, but it's important to stress not to rely on this map as something stable. The period is one of almost constant change in territories, hegemonies, and arguably cultures. It has often been argued that the prominence of TYCHE, the Greek god of fortune or fate, as the focus of worship in the Hellenistic period is indicative of an awareness and preoccupation with the caprices of fate perceived as guiding the success or destruction of a city. The emergence of the city-specific tyches, or TYCHE in the Greek, represents concern not for the Hellenistic world as a whole, or even the kingdom of one's residence, but the city itself, which may grow or be annihilated according to the will of TYCHE. The most famous sculptural representation of TYCHE is the TYCHE of Antioch, a Roman copy of a believed bronze Hellenistic original from Antioch, a major Seleucid city in modern-day Turkey, situated on the banks of the Orontes River. Her crown represents the city walls. In her hand, she holds a sheaf of corn, and she rests her feet on a personification of the river Orontes. The strength of the city walls, the provision of food, and the flooding of the river are all at the mercy of her will. Such was the uncertainty of the period. The changes and uncertainty of the period led to many cultural adaptations, producing beautiful and unique works of art. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, which incorporate modern-day Afghanistan, produced some of the most spectacular and fascinating works of the time. Some of you may have had the chance to see this example in person at the 2013-2014 Afghanistan Hidden Treasures from the National Museum of Kabul exhibition, which toured Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, and Perth. Here you can see a golden applique interpreted as representing Aphrodite. Her tilted hip and falling drapery is typical of Hellenic sculpture, but the styling of the wings indicates a Persian influence. Most spectacularly, the pronounced bindi on her forehead shows prominent Indian cultural connection. Before I go over my process and results, I feel it's worth looking into the rationale behind why this may be worth considering at all. Here you can see a selection of sculptures probably familiar to you, more or less as you would have seen them in their displayed positions today. We have Michelangelo's David, Rodin's Thinker, and Duchamp's Fountain. These works are all well known and thoroughly studied in relation to the lives, beliefs, and intents of the artists, which are taken to be the fundamental underpinnings of the work's interest and existence. You would expect to see these works in a gallery, a place where we are familiar with seeing art displayed in a particular way and for a particular reason. Ironically, perhaps, however, only Duchamp's Fountain was created with the intent of being displayed this way. Michelangelo's David was commissioned on request by the Office of Works of the Cathedral as one of 12 biblical figures intended to adorn the Cathedral di Santa Maria. Rodin's Thinker was only one ornament on his unfinished life work, The Gates of Hell, commissioned by the Directorate of Fine Arts as the entrance to a new museum which was never constructed. Fountain was never commissioned. It was never made for anything other than taking the piss. Pause for laughter. It is a clear, ferociously independent artistic statement which cannot be said of the others without qualification. The others were works commissioned as part of a larger project that was not of the artist's own hand. Here you can see three Hellenistic sculptures you may be familiar with: the Aphrodite of Melos, or the Venus de Milo, the Nike of Samothrace, and the Laocoon. The Venus de Milo and Nike of Samothrace are displayed in the Louvre, and the Laocoon, once in the Louvre, has now been repatriated to the Vatican Museum. They are all displayed as artistic masterpieces. Yet none of these sculptures should be seen as independent works by free creative auteurs. The works are products of the highest caliber, created by exceptional craftsmen, but products commissioned on the request of wealthy patrons who would determine the content and placement of the work. The essential message behind the work belongs first and foremost to these patrons, and not to the artists. The rule of history in general has been that art, or at least what might commonly be called high art, is created on the commission of wealthy patrons, not the initiative of free artists making statements in their own voice. The patron was the final determinant of the work, and as such, the work should be seen as representative of their voice more than that of the artist. In this late medieval triptych, for instance, we see the patron even has the honor of being personally depicted, over there in the left-hand panel, kneeling down. Patronage of art has generally been restricted to the ultra-wealthy, with the cost of a typical bronze sculpture estimated at a modern-day equivalent of $278,000 US. Patronage of art in the Hellenistic period was a process by which wealthy and powerful individuals could publicly display their involvement in political life. Benefaction was viewed as an integral component of just rulership in the Hellenistic period, where rulers acted as stewards of the cities or kingdoms under their control and were expected to use their tremendous wealth and influence to benefit the lives of their subjects. In theory, a mutually beneficial arrangement, in theory. However, for the politically ambitious, the act of benefaction was used as a means of furthering one's own political ambitions, a concept known as euergetism, which has been defined variously as the advertisement of generosity or the donation of material gifts by individuals repaid with symbolic rewards by the city. This reciprocity might be thought of as comparable to the modern political practice of pork barreling, where disproportionate amounts of public funding are allocated to marginal seats. Political elite offer material gifts in hopes of a symbolic or political reward, a quid pro quo. However, the practice of euergetism was more than simple reciprocal benefaction. It was a means by which the wealthy and powerful could make a permanent public statement of values and societal norms. By the choices they made in the figures depicted in public spaces, patrons were making implicit statements of the nature of that society, such as who rightfully wields power. In this way, the patronage of public art by the elite may be read as propagandistic, understanding propaganda as a conscious attempt by a social group to impose or encourage an attitude by exploiting communication media. One of the more explicitly propagandistic sculptural types seen across the Hellenistic world that emerges in the period is the depiction of fallen enemies. By the depiction of these fallen foes, Hellenistic rulers implicitly positioned themselves as saviors of the state, pronouncing a favorable public image of their rule. But enough waffle. Essentially, what I have tried to show is that Hellenistic sculptures were not independent works expressing the unique voices of free artists, but pieces more complex. And one means of looking at them is to treat them not with the eye of art analysis, but as data points indicative of cultural trends emerging from the interaction of the wealthy elite and common inhabitants of the Hellenistic world. As such, a quantitative approach holds potential as a means of defining and exploring these trends. So this was the basis of my thesis, a large-scale database of as many examples of large-scale Hellenistic period sculpture I could source, organized across a range of variables, which can be seen at the top of the screen here. These variables included whether the figure depicted a human or a god, the sex of the figure, the type of figure depicted. So for instance, whether a human figure was a ruler or an athlete, or whether a divine figure was Athena or Aphrodite, the century of construction, the material of construction, so bronze or marble or occasionally gold and ivory, and 3 different measures of size, scale, as in life-sized or colossal, the dimensions of the extant remains in centimeters, and an estimate of the original height in centimeters, which I estimated myself by extrapolating from the extant remains using the ratios for the human figure recorded in the canon of the sculptor Polykleitos. The intent of the project was to determine whether, reading public sculpture as fundamentally a form of ruling class propaganda, variations between regions of the Hellenistic world could be determined statistically. And if such distinctions were statistically evident, whether cultural variations could be inferred from them. So, for example, if it turns out that colossal sculpture was overrepresented in the corpus of Ptolemaic sculpture, it may be argued that this was a result of Ptolemaic appropriation of dynastic Egyptian sculptural norms, as an example. So the next question to ask is, what are these regional divisions? The most immediate answer would be to categorize sculpture by kingdoms, so the Ptolemies, Antigonids, Seleucids, and other minor kingdoms. But the problem with this approach is that the Hellenistic world was politically unstable. Alliances shifted as frequently as borders, and without the ability to precisely date works of sculpture, which is almost never an option, this delineation would be inherently tentative. So for instance, a sculpture found in a particular city may be dated to within a span of 100 years based on art historical interpretation. If it were dated to 240 BCE, it would be classified as a Seleucid, but it may in fact be Bactrian if the date range was out by only 50 years or so. So instead, I decided to classify the Hellenistic world into 3 regions, dependent on the inhabitant population, rather than the political entity in power. A map of the proposed divisions is shown here, made using GIS. All kingdoms of the Hellenistic world were ruled almost exclusively by a class of culturally Hellenic, ethnically Greco-Macedonian elite. However, they ruled over vastly different subject populations. In the west remained the same culturally Hellenic group from which these rulers had emerged following Alexander. In the south was a primarily Egyptian population, and in the east, a collection of varying cultures previously ruled by the Persian Achaemenid Empire. By adopting the above proposed regional distinction, the aim of the project was twofold: to determine statistically the validity of the proposed division, and subsequently to consider how the culturally uniform ruling class of the Hellenistic kingdoms adapted their propagandistic sculptural programs to suit their culturally varied audiences. Once the database had been finalized at 347 entries, these entries were numerically coded, as shown on the left of your screen, for statistical analysis. This picture shows the same entries I had shown on the previous slide, but now coded and pared down to facilitate analysis. The data was entered into IBM's Statistics Package for the Social Sciences, SPSS, software for analysis, as shown on the right. SPSS software was used first to obtain descriptive breakdowns of the database, as shown on screen, before the much more interesting process of statistical analysis was begun. Tests of variance and difference were made on the data, including t-tests and ANOVA, but primarily chi-squared analyses, as shown on screen. The value of these statistical tests is that rather than simply summarizing the data, they account for the random variation within the groups and determine the probability of whether the mean differences between groups is attributable to random chance, or rather reflects true underlying group differences. So for instance, on the left, we can see that while figure size did vary between regions, the variation was not consistent and substantial enough to justly conclude that this difference was attributable to true group differences, as there is a 24.6% probability of the results being due to random chance resulting from selection. Clovedness, however, shown on the right, differ between groups so consistently that there is a less than 1% probability of the observed group differences being due to chance, and so the data almost certainly reflects a true difference. This is the benefit of statistical analysis over simple comparison. Although simple comparison allows us to make pretty things like this, which I also included because I like them. Over the process of my thesis, I was able to take hundreds of beautiful things, such as the Lady of the Sea shown on the left, and turn it into a mass of ugly numbers and charts, as shown on the right. So the question is, why did I commit this atrocity? Well, happily, the numbers came through for me. On screen now, you can see the more prominent results of my analysis in brief. I am of the belief that the analysis conducted validates the legitimacy of my proposed cultural division as a lens through which to investigate the art, culture, and social political dynamics of the Hellenistic period. A proof of concept which I hope will encourage new avenues of investigation to be taken in future research. Okay, so what I've just described was the process of my thesis. Since that time, as a bit of a prep project more than anything else, I've been working on transferring the data from its rudimentary format in a spreadsheet into a more organized, user-friendly, and navigable database using the Heurist Network. The Heurist Network is an online database system developed by Ian Johnson within the University of Sydney, developed as a free and open source database for the humanities, which doesn't require any coding knowledge or particular technical expertise, although I won't claim that using it isn't quite fiddly. As I'm adapting the existing spreadsheet into the database rather than building the database from the ground up, it is something of an extensive process of data entry. But the end result is something much more user-friendly and appealing. Of most interest to myself personally, it facilitates the immediate development of a customizable web page from the created database. Here is the website in its current state, showing the navigability of the database. As an example, this shows the process one may go through if they wish to research sculptures of Aphrodite, specifically from the 2nd century. Inputting these filters, one is able to view a map displaying the proveniences of those known statues. An example can be selected where the image is shown alongside a brief summary, and further information, including references to texts which mention the sculpture, can be requested. This is a time-consuming and long-running side project, but I'm hopeful that once the database has been transferred completely, the website could serve as a convenient learning tool for students and for the general public. As a final point, the great thing about a database is that, like the Hellenistic patrons and sculptures I was investigating, it is adaptable. While my research was able to propose several comparisons or suggestions from the catalogue data, the data is not tethered interminably to these suggestions. It can be used repeatedly into the future to test out ideas I could not think of and facilitate study for future researchers I may never meet. Thank you very much.